All right, our focus today is on this software called TRIAGE. It was developed by AbaData, and we're going to look at how it's kind of changing the game of pipeline management.
Yeah.
Think of it as like a detective for your pipelines, uncovering all those hidden risks that those traditional assessments often miss.
It all begins with understanding this problem that's often overlooked. It's the impact of upstream well behavior. So imagine a well that's been sitting idle for a while, maybe some gunk has built up inside, and then suddenly it's fired back up at full blast. Now this creates this surge of liquid that acts like a shockwave, dislodging all that debris that's accumulated and sending it just hurtling down the pipeline.
Okay, so it's like a mini tsunami inside the wellbore.
Yep.
But how does this actually cause pipelines to fail?
The real danger lies in what that surge is actually carrying with it. Things like biomass, sulfur deposits, and even compacted sludge. All this debris can be highly corrosive, and when it's mobilized like that and sent downstream, it just wreaks havoc on the pipeline. TRIAGE digs deep into a well's production history. It analyzes its behavior over time to actually identify potential problems before they even happen. It looks for things like irregular operation, high water cut, or other red flags that might suggest a buildup of debris. And a higher risk of this shockwave effect, it goes a step further by actually simulating the hydraulics of the well to predict how bad that debris mobilization might be during a startup.
But how does it do that? Does it have some kind of crystal ball or something?
Advanced fluid dynamics modeling. TRIAGE uses this technology to anticipate the forces at play and to determine how likely it is that debris is going to get dislodged. It takes all of this information, the well's history, the hydraulic modeling, the characteristics of the pipeline, and it compares it to its massive database of historical failures.
So it's learning from past mistakes to prevent future ones.
Precisely. By identifying pipelines that share similarities with those that have experienced failures due to debris mobilization, TRIAGE can provide targeted and actionable insights.
But how does this actually translate into action? What can operators actually do to prevent these failures once TRIAGE has identified them?
That's where TRIAGE really shines. It doesn't just point out the problems, it actually provides solutions. Let's say TRIAGE spots a pipeline with a history of irregular well production, which makes it prone to debris buildup. In that case, it might recommend a more frequent pigging schedule. TRIAGE takes all the guesswork out of pipeline maintenance. So instead of relying on those generic schedules, operators can really focus on what each pipeline actually needs, making their efforts much more efficient and effective.
This is incredible. It's like having a personalized maintenance plan for each pipeline, ensuring they're getting the care that they need.
But what about those teams on the ground, the ones who are actually responsible for carrying out these recommendations? How does TRIAGE help them?
Well, one of the most powerful aspects of TRIAGE is its integration with AbaData's Field Ops module. Think of this module as like a mobile command center. For pipeline management, it's accessible right from a tablet or a phone. Okay, so it's like having all of TRIAGE's insights and recommendations right there at your fingertips, no matter where you are in the field.
Exactly. Field teams can access real-time risk assessments. They can get those specific recommendations for each pipeline segment. And they can even record their maintenance activities, like pigging runs or chemical treatments, and all of this information is then fed back into TRIAGE.
So it's like a continuous feedback loop.
That's right. TRIAGE is constantly learning. It's adapting, providing increasingly targeted guidance over time. It's not just about identifying those risks. It's about empowering those field teams to take action and actually see the results of their efforts.
This is fantastic. It really bridges that gap.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another key group that benefits from TRIAGE's insights, the chemical teams. So TRIAGE can help them move away from that one-size-fits-all approach to chemical treatment, and instead create strategies that are tailored to each pipeline.
So instead of just throwing a bunch of chemicals at the problem and hoping for the best, they can be more strategic and targeted in their approach.
Exactly. TRIAGE provides those teams with a deep understanding of each pipeline's specific needs. It analyzes things like the types of corrosive agents present, the pipeline's flow dynamics, the effectiveness of existing treatments. All of this information helps them determine the right chemicals, the right quantities, and the right timing for treatments. TRIAGE also plays a crucial role in identifying emerging corrosion threats. By analyzing trends in the data, it can alert chemical teams to potential problems before they even become major issues, giving them time to develop new treatment strategies and stay ahead of the curve.
How do we know if those efforts are actually making a difference?
That's another area where TRIAGE excels. Remember that feedback loop we talked about earlier? Well, all of those field activities that are recorded in the field ops module are fed back into triage, allowing it to actually track the impact of those actions on the pipeline's risk profile.
So it's like a before and after comparison. We can see how the pipeline's risk score changes over time as those mitigation efforts are implemented.
Exactly. This allows operators to see if their efforts are actually reducing the risk, giving them the data they need to adjust their strategies, and continuously improve their pipeline management practices. It's essentially a baseline assessment. The mitigated risk matrix, on the other hand, takes into account the mitigation measures that are already in place, such as pigging programs, chemical treatments,
Right.
and operating procedures.
So it's like a snapshot of the pipeline's current risk level after those protective measures have been factored in.
Precisely. By comparing those two matrices, operators can actually see the impact of their mitigation efforts. They can see how much risk those efforts are reducing and identify areas where they might need to do more. And it's a powerful tool for driving that continuous improvement. It allows operators to constantly evaluate their efforts, make adjustments as needed, and strive for that ultimate goal of zero failures. One of the key things to keep in mind is that triage relies heavily on data, so the accuracy of its assessments and recommendations really depends on the quality and completeness of the data it's fed. That's why it's so crucial to ensure that the data being used is accurate and complete, and that's where those data validation reports we mentioned earlier come in handy. They provide a way to double-check the data, make corrections if needed, and ensure that triage is working with the best possible information.
This is fascinating. Let's dive into each of those elements. Starting with well behavior, what are some of the specific things that triage is analyzing to assess that corrosion risk?
Well, one of the most important factors is the well's production history. Think back to those debris surges we talked about earlier. Those are often triggered by sudden changes in well production.
Right, like when a well is suddenly restarted after being idle for a while.
Exactly. So triage looks at the well's production rates over time, any fluctuations, shut-in periods, and other patterns that might suggest a buildup of debris and a higher risk of those surges.
So it's like looking for red flags in the well's behavior. That might indicate a higher risk of corrosion downstream.
Precisely.
This is all incredibly impressive. But I'm kind of curious about the technical side of things. How does triage actually process all of this data? We're talking about massive amounts of information from various sources. How does it make sense of it all?
That's where triage's sophisticated algorithms and data analysis capabilities come into play. It uses a powerful connectivity algorithm to create a map of the entire pipeline network, connecting wells to pipelines and pipelines to facilities.
So it's creating a giant interconnected web of information.
Exactly. This map allows triage to understand how fluids are flowing through the entire system, identifying potential bottlenecks and areas where corrosion is more likely to occur.
That sounds like a really powerful way to visualize the entire pipeline network and pinpoint those high-risk zones.
It is. And once triage has this map, it can start analyzing the data from each individual component, using its pattern recognition capabilities to identify pipelines that share similarities with those that have experienced failures in the past. By comparing the characteristics of a given pipeline and its associated wells to historical failure data, triage can identify pipelines that might be at higher risk of failing in the future.
I imagine there are instances
Yeah.
where certain information might be missing. How does it handle those situations?
That's where triage's smart defaults come in. These are expert-developed values, based on typical operating conditions in Alberta, which is the region where triage was developed. And to ensure transparency, triage generates a data validation report that outlines all the assumptions made during the risk assessment.
So users can see exactly where those default values were used and adjust them if needed.
Precisely. This allows users to verify or refine the data, ensuring that the risk assessment is as accurate and relevant as possible, regardless of location.
Okay, so we've talked about how triage analyzes data. It identifies risks, and it even fills in those data gaps when necessary. But how does it actually help those operators address those risks?
That's where those mitigation recommendations we discussed earlier come into play. So based on the risk assessment, triage provides specific recommendations for each pipeline segment. This guidance helps those field teams develop those effective corrosion management plans that we talked about. It might recommend adjusting pigging frequencies, implementing specific chemical treatment programs, or even modifying operating procedures. So for example, if triage identifies a high risk of debris buildup due to fluctuating well production, it might recommend increasing the frequency of pigging runs to clear out that debris before it becomes a problem. Triage generates a variety of reports, each one designed to provide specific insights and guidance. One of the key reports is the mitigation report.
And this is the one that lays out those tailored recommendations for each pipeline segment.
Exactly. It's like a roadmap for protecting the pipeline, outlining those specific actions that field ops teams and chemical teams should take to mitigate those risks. And to make sure that everyone's on the same page, Triage also generates a data validation report. This report outlines all the assumptions made during the risk assessment, including any default values that were used.
So it's like a transparency, showing users exactly how Triage arrived at its conclusions.
That's right. This transparency is crucial for building trust in the system and making sure that everyone understands the basis for those recommendations.
This has been an amazing deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the technical details of how Triage assesses risk to the broader implications of this whole data-driven approach to pipeline management.
It's been a pleasure to share these insights with you.
We've learned how upstream well behavior can impact those downstream pipelines, how Triage by AbaData is really kind of revolutionizing pipeline management, and how its insights empower field ops and chemical teams to make informed decisions and implement those effective mitigation strategies. We're really witnessing a paradigm shift in the industry, moving away from those reactive measures to a world where data and technology are used proactively to prevent those failures before they even happen.
It's an exciting time to be involved in this evolution.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive. Thanks for joining us.